commission d'enquête sur les relations entre les Autochtones et certains services publics au Québec, présidée par l'honorable Jacques Viens, est maintenant ouverte. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Alors, bonjour. Bienvenue en cette nouvelle semaine. Alors, Madame la greffière, si vous vouliez procéder à l'identification des procureurs pour les fins de l'enregistrement.
C'est ça.
Évidemment, les procureurs, on les connaît, mais l'enregistrement, on a besoin de le faire.
Est-ce que les procureurs ainsi que les organismes que vous représentez peuvent s'identifier pour les fins d'enregistrement, s'il vous plaît?
Marie-Josée Bergosselin, procureure en chef adjoint de la commission d'enquête.
Alors, bonjour.
Maître Rainbow Miller, pour Femmes autochtones du Québec.
Bonjour à vous aussi.
Bonjour, Maître.
Bonjour, Maître Boucher.
Bonjour.
Maître Jean-François Artaud pour la Régie de la santé et des services sociaux du Nunavik et pour l'Association des femmes inuites du Nunavik aussi.
Bonjour, Maître Artaud.
Bonjour à vous.
Alors, bienvenue, vous tous et toutes, procureurs. Pouvez-vous nous donner une idée du programme de la journée et de la semaine, si vous souhaitez?
Certainement, Monsieur le commissaire. Premièrement, je voudrais m'excuser. On a quelques minutes de retard ce matin. C'est un petit problème technique, mais rien de majeur. Je vais vous faire un portrait de la semaine. Ce matin, on entendra Mme Carole Brazeau, qui est coordonnatrice au Cercle national autochtone contre la violence familiale. Pour l'avant-midi, on sera en compagnie de Mme Brazeau. Cet après-midi, ainsi que demain matin, c'est M. Serge Bouchard qui va venir faire une présentation à la commission d'enquête, M. Bouchard qui est anthropologue. Mercredi, il n'y aura pas d'audience cette semaine, dont le 27, il y aura relâche d'audience, mais pas relâche de travail, évidemment. Et ensuite, les deux dernières journées du bloc de septembre, soit jeudi et vendredi, seront des journées très chargées. Jeudi, le 28 septembre, on entendra des gens de la nation Huron-Wendat en avant-midi et également des gens de la Régie régionale de la santé des services sociaux du Nunavik et de l'Association des femmes inuites du Nunavik. La présentation débutera en avant-midi, mais vraisemblablement se prolongera en début d'après-midi. Et on terminera avec le chef de la communauté Mohawk de Kanawake. Ensuite, c'est la journée de jeudi, donc qui est bien chargée. La journée de vendredi, il y aura le chef Steve Mathias, qui est le chef de la communauté de Long Point First Nation. Ensuite, il y aura des témoins du Conseil CRI de la santé et des services sociaux, 3 témoins qui viendront s'adresser sur le Conseil CRI de la santé et des services sociaux. Et finalement, on terminera avec une présentation d'Amnesty International vendredi après-midi avec la présidente et la directrice générale. Donc, c'est le projet de la semaine, Monsieur le commissaire.
Très bien. Alors, je comprends que vous commencez avec Mme Brazeau ce matin.
Oui, certainement.
Mme Brazeau, bienvenue.
Merci.
Ça fait plaisir de vous recevoir à Val-d'Or, à la commission.
Et Mme Brazeau, en fait, témoignera en partie en anglais, vraisemblablement une bonne partie de la présentation en anglais, peut-être certaines interventions en français également. On ajustera. Je vais immédiatement, si vous me permettez, Monsieur le commissaire, déposer les 3 documents qui seront utilisés par Mme Brazeau, ou du moins qui sont pertinents au témoignage de Mme Brazeau. Les 3 documents, donc le premier sous la cote P099, c'est le manuel d'information juridique à l'intention des intervenants des maisons d'hébergement. Et en liasse, je vais déposer la version française ainsi que la version anglaise du document. Sous P100, le rapport alternatif au Comité des Nations unies sur l'élimination de la discrimination raciale. Encore une fois, la version française et en liasse la version anglaise. Le Cercle national nous a fourni des copies de courtoisie en français et en anglais. On l'apprécie beaucoup. Et finalement, sous P101, un document qui s'intitule « La loi sur les foyers familiaux situés dans les réserves et les droits ou intérêts matrimoniaux et le droit de la famille au Québec, comparaison et analyse constitutionnelle ». Et encore une fois, on déposera le document en français et en anglais en liasse. Sous la cote 101. Donc, Mme Brazeau, comme je vous l'indiquais un petit peu plus tôt, Monsieur le commissaire, est la coordonnatrice nationale du Cercle national autochtone contre la violence familiale, qui est un organisme non gouvernemental qui s'intéresse plus particulièrement à la question des foyers d'hébergement, mais également de la violence familiale en contexte autochtone. Il fera une présentation et également des recommandations pour la commission. Je demanderai à Mme la greffière d'assermenter le témoin qui a également signifié vouloir témoigner avec une plume. Et ensuite, je vais laisser la parole à Mme Brazeau.
Alors, Madame Brazeau, vous affirmez solennellement de dire la vérité, toute la vérité, rien que la vérité. Dites « je l'affirme ».
Je l'affirme.
Votre nom?
Carole Brazeau.
Votre profession?
Coordonnatrice
Oui.
du Cercle national autochtone contre la violence familiale.
Merci, Madame. Votre témoin?
Donc, bienvenue, Mme Brazeau. Je vais vous laisser vous adresser au commissaire. Au besoin, des questions pourront vous être posées en cours de présentation. Merci.
Merci. Okay. Monsieur le commissaire, bonjour.
Oui, bonjour à vous aussi.
Comme on a expliqué, je vais faire ma présentation en anglais. Donc, I would like to congratulate you all on your accomplishment in establishing the Quebec Public Inquiry Commission on relations between Indigenous peoples and certain public services in Quebec in such a timely manner as well. So I know we still have a long walk, and especially in the redistribution of wealth, I understand that there's some gold mining going on, as example, in Val d'Or. So, you know, we are, of course, concerned for the safety of all women and children, but I'm sure that the Amnesty International will speak on that this week as well. So I'll give a brief overview of the National Aboriginal Circle Against Family Violence, NACAF, advocates for and supports women's shelters who provide services to Indigenous women and children who are victims of violence by providing practical training, culturally appropriate resources, and opportunities to network to reduce the isolation. So founded in 1999 and incorporated in 2002, the NACAF, as you mentioned, is a national non-profit and non-governmental organization. So in terms of the subject matter of racism today, it's always good to give, you know, our definition of it. So racism can be defined as well as one people's false belief in their superiority to another. And we understand that the root cause as well of social issues are a symptom of colonization and systemic racism. So at the macro level, by the peoples who have the political and economic power in that society. So our offices are located in Ganawage, Quebec, and our umbrella organization includes the province of Quebec. And the NACAF has a voluntary board of directors, and our president, Sheila Swanson, is the manager of the community services with the Listigouche First Nations government in Quebec. And our other NACAF board members are from Alberta, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So I'll begin with a general overview of the NACAF's mandate, which is to reduce family violence in Aboriginal communities by supporting the women's shelters and the shelter practitioners, the frontline workers who work diligently to provide safe family environments. And we do this mainly by advocacy and training. So we do this by initiating, designing, and delivering culturally appropriate training and tools for all women's shelters. We are providing networking support to share wise practices or best practices and to reduce isolation for shelter workers in remote communities. And working on the national level to advocate for shelters and promote partnerships with Indigenous, non-governmental organizations, federal, provincial, and territorial governments. We promote public awareness of the depth of the issues surrounding family violence in Indigenous communities. So I'll speak a little bit about the systemic discrimination and government funding of services, which is in the manual that we presented this morning. So the Legal Information and Training Toolkit Manual. So in most communities in Canada, social services are funded through the provincial governments. But in First Nations reserves, these services are funded through the federal government. This unique arrangement is the basis of misleading claims about the federal government spending a lot of extra money on First Nations. The NACAF reports that currently there are, in actual fact, 39 operational, federally funded women's shelters in Canada. So in February 2017, the federal government announced plans to build another 5 for the 634 First Nations communities. Moreover, there exists this funding disparity as all other women's shelters in Canada, including in Quebec, receive more funding than First Nations women's shelters that are INAC funded. In 2007, 10 years ago, Dr. Anita Olsen-Harper recommended in the NACAF study called Addressing Funding Policy Issues, INAC-funded women's shelters. This study was funded by the Saddest Women Canada, and it says that INAC-funded shelters must at least receive parity funding in line with provincially funded non-Native shelters. Therefore, the NACAF has denounced this case of systemic discrimination and continues to demand in 2017 funding parity for all First Nations women's shelters in Canada. So, one fact is services on reserve often receive significantly less money per person from the federal government when compared to what the provincial and territorial governments spend in other communities. This is despite the fact that the historic arms may mean that the needs of First Nations communities are greater. And I'll speak a little to that later on, what those are. But especially, you know, the high rate of violence, as you know, against Indigenous women in Quebec and all of Canada. Furthermore, the cost of providing social services in small communities are often much higher, particularly when these communities are relatively isolated. The result is that many services available in other communities are simply not available in First Nations communities or are provided on a more limited and less effective basis. As a result, First Nations women seeking to escape an abusive relationship may have to travel great distances and may not have the access to services tailored to their specific needs. This could be argued to create a substantive inequality in service provision of shelters. So we recommended that the number of shelters be increased significantly, as in the NACAF's recommendations to the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Quebec should also call upon the federal government to act immediately to eliminate all discrimination in funding for emergency shelters and related services for Indigenous women and children, including by significantly increasing the number of emergency shelters serving First Nations Indigenous communities. As well, Women's Shelters Canada also supported this recommendation and also recommended that funding attached to each shelter also be increased significantly. So there's also Amnesty Canada's campaign for Canada to close the funding gap to ensure safety and support for Indigenous women and girls escaping violence. Their campaign says that every woman and girl has a right to live safely without threat of violence, intimidation, or harassment. And I'll speak to that later, but they also urge that the federal government to work closely with Quebec and the NACAF and Inuit women to close the gap in support for Indigenous peoples, women and children who are survivors of violence. So I'll speak regarding the Quebec women's shelters now, more specifically. So there are currently about 9 operational women's shelters in Quebec, and the 7 federally funded women's shelters are located in Listigouche, Schefferville, Sept-Îles, Gittigan-Zibi, Letuc, Obidjiwan, and Akwesasne. We've included Akwesasne here, which borders Quebec, Ontario, and the United States. And the 2 provincially funded First Nations women's shelters are in Montreal, with 50% about, at the time that I was there, residents are being Inuit, and in the Quebec City. So up until recently, 100% of the Cree communities had no shelter. So today, congratulations goes to them, because finally one shelter named the Robin's Nest is being inaugurated this morning in Waswanipi. And so we congratulate the Cree Nation for that. As well, there will be another, we understand, in progress. So the Cree women and children previously of the 9 communities in James Bay were sent to the Montreal Native Women's Shelter, as well as the Val d'Or's Ligny shelter. And there was actually a women's shelter in Chisasibi in the 1990s, but it closed, and Cree women and children were sent to Montreal, Val d'Or, or to traditional bush placement. And the other shelter that's being currently built is in Waskaganish, where in case of emergency situations, women and children were placed with a family within the community. So in Canada, there are 15 shelters in the 53 Inuit communities. So I don't know if you'll be having the Inuit women speaking to that. So there are 3, we understand, here in Quebec, and so we understand that 80% of the Inuit communities here in Quebec do not have a shelter. So in Canada, as I said, there are only 39 operational federally funded shelters for the 634 communities. Therefore, that's 94% of First Nations communities do not have a women's shelter in Canada. And in Quebec, 26% of the communities with the new shelters will have a women's shelter. So 74% of First Nations and Inuit communities in Quebec do not have a women's shelter. So also, you know, in a comparative analysis, if we look at the rest of Canada, we did do some consultations there, and we know that other provinces have women's centers, which Quebec does not. Quebec has no women's center, and there definitely needs to be, I would say, you know, a need to create safe spaces for Indigenous women and children here in Quebec.
Madame Brazo, can you please explain a little bit more what is a woman center versus woman shelter or family shelter?
Yeah, so with a women's shelter is more of a residential and a safe space for cases of emergency, you know, victims of violence and other situations that women may find themselves in precariously. And so for a women's center is, it exists, it's not, it exists for different reasons. There are many in Quebec. L'Aire des Femmes is the umbrella organization for all women's centers with, that operate, you know, on a, basically on a 9-to-5 basis. They're safe, they're for women and children, spaces for women and children. So there are often, there's some in all the provinces, specifically for different groups, and for Indigenous women and children, there aren't any in Quebec.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the NAICS members include the Quebec Native Women's Shelter Network, so and we have other provincial shelter networks in Canada, and so the Quebec Native Women, you know, as you know, is for promotes nonviolence in this shelter network, and it's the oldest file at the Quebec Native Women, and the Quebec Native Women was the first organization to denounce violence in the Indigenous communities in Quebec, as you know. So the Quebec Native Women's actions centered on analyzing the causes of this violence, raising awareness of family violence within and outside of communities by promoting non-violent solutions to the situation and taking into account all members of the community. So Quebec Native Women also works very closely with Indigenous women's shelters in Quebec. In 2012, the NAICAV conducted a consultation with the Quebec Native Women's Shelter Network, members in Quebec City, as well as we had the consultation meetings with individual shelter directors in La Tuque, Gatigan-Zibi, and Montreal. And this was to determine the shelter practitioners' needs for legal information in helping victims of violence navigate through the legal system. As well, in September 2016, since the on-reserve matrimonial real property rights came into effect as of December 16, 2014, the NACAF provided 2 trainings, one in English and one in French, to the women shelter practitioners in Quebec. And this was thanks to the NACAF's Legal Information and Training Toolkit project, which was funded by the Status of Women Canada and the Department of Justice. So 30% of the participants in this consultation were from Quebec, actually. And I just want to speak about a little bit about the matrimonial real property rights, because we do have a partnership with the Center of Excellence for MRP, and they would really be the experts in that field, so they could probably go into more details regarding that. And the province of Quebec, though we'll speak of some positive notes, compared to the rest of Canada, does have mechanisms in place to assist victims of violence, family violence, that other provinces do not. For example, the Ministère de la Justice Québec may appoint for a period of 3 years women shelter practitioners to be commissioner of votes, enabling them to assist the residents of women shelters, victims of violence, to break a lease, for example, in cases of domestic violence. Okay, so now I'll speak to the issue of funding disparity of INAC-funded shelters. And the challenge is, of course, the demographic and geographic realities in limited access to service for survivors of violence. So we did speak a little bit before, and she said it was important that I do mention, I know that the period of this commission is from the past 15 years, but just to put into historical context, I'll briefly talk about our traditional values of Indigenous peoples and brief history, just to contextualize. So traditionally, in the Indigenous societies, and it's important to note that, that history didn't start with 500 years ago or at the point of colonization, that we always say we've been here since time immemorial. And during that time, women were treated as equal members of society, holding central roles in families, government structures, and spiritual ceremonies. Indigenous spirituality honors women, and only women are the channels between the spirit world and Mother Earth. And those are the teachings that we received. And the differing roles of Indigenous women and men were equally valued. And but the violence that Indigenous women and their children now experience at alarming rates represent a disruption and loss of the balance valued and protected in Indigenous societies. Violence, of course, is not part of our cultural values, but is an effect of colonization. So murdered and Indigenous women today, women and children, remain a major human rights issue and requires all of society to become educated on how to resolve this violation through education, love, respect, and compassion. And that is to quote from our manual again, a quote from Ellen Gabriel. So traditionally, whether matrilineal or patrilineal, extended families were protective of their family members, preventing violence against Indigenous women and children. So we know that extended families, there were mechanisms when we had brothers in the household, I'm sure, would not permit this violence to happen in a family home. So now with the introduction of the nuclear family, this also has disrupted the social fabric of our families and communities in the history. And so I'll speak a little bit about the historical discrimination and trauma. So it's also widely recognized that the higher levels and more severe forms of violence experienced by Indigenous women and children is grounded in the oppressive and discriminatory treatment of Indigenous individuals and societies throughout Canadian history. As the following dimensions of this historical trauma are particularly important to acknowledge because of their profound lasting impacts. And we would like to also mention, of course, to remind people that the history of the Americas did start with a genocide and the genocides of Indigenous peoples. And the wholesale disposition of lands and natural resources has severely eroded the self-sufficiency of Indigenous peoples. The erosion of traditional livelihoods, such as hunting, fishing, gathering, medicinal plant gathering, also affected the roles of Indigenous women and men in their communities. So it has been said that the Indian problem is that we have too much land. So this could also be viewed as a root cause of the situation that we find ourselves today. In 1927, amendment to the Indian Act forbade payment to any lawyer to work on land claims. This facilitated further land takeovers until that was repealed in 1951 only here in Canada. So it's beginning with the Indian Act in 1885. The federal government outlawed many of First Nations' key institutions and traditions that maintain social cohesion in First Nations communities. This was accompanied by the imposition of a foreign system of elected band governments. And also, as you know, for a 150-year period in Canada, existed the residential school system. And you know, my mother is a residential school survivor. She's originally lives still in Giddigan-Zibi, and she was sent to a residential school in Kenora, Ontario, as a child. So, and I have other relatives as well. So during that period of 155 years, we know that Canada is also 155 years old. I'm originally I was born in Maniwaki, and we know that the community of Giddigan-Zibi is also over 150 years old. We know that we're speaking of a celebration of Canada, 150 years old as well. So, in an effort to forcibly break Indigenous women's ties to their cultures and communities, the federal government carried a policy of mass removal of children from their homes to attend these residential institutions, schools they call them, often located far from their communities. The children were severely punished. For speaking their language. We know that language is an important issue here in Quebec. For our people, we know that, we understand that we can only speak this language here in North America. We know that French is spoken in other countries, and so is English. But here is the only place where we can speak this language and to learn it as well. It's just important to know that, you know. So including young children for speaking the language were horrifically electrocuted in some schools. Staffed, often clergy, often abused children and this was with impunity. These traumatic experiences deprive many Indigenous peoples of positive parenting models in the case of their own children. So approximately 3,000 children died during the residential school era. So we can call this also colonization. And more than that, it was a genocide. And as defined by the UN as when you take one people's children away from another. One of the most profound lasting effects of the residential school system was to deny generations of Indigenous women and men positive examples of how children should be treated. So, a provincial justice inquiry in Manitoba concluded that the treatment of children in residential schools began a cycle of abuse in Aboriginal communities, with women and children being the primary victims. The severity of the combined impact of these and other colonial policies are reflected in the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, which was established to create a public account of the residential school system and its legacy. The TRC concluded, for over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policies were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. And I quote, "The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which they say the TRCs can be best described as cultural genocide." So the lasting impacts of these policies have been to create and perpetuate distinctive patterns of violence, discrimination, and marginalization for Indigenous women and their families, include continued racism and intergenerational violence. And I'd like to speak a little bit today about the health and social services and youth protection services here in Quebec, because it is a little bit of a continuation of the historical trauma and story here that I'm speaking of to you today. I know that it's important to speak of personal stories that we were saying, like not just qualitative data, but some quantitative as well. And I know that for a fact that an elder has reported to me that she was denied services, and others as well, she says, in the CLSC, in the community of Kitikanzi, because of course I'm often there visiting my family. So I just wanted to say that Indigenous peoples have a right to an equal access to the healthcare system. For example, hospitals, CLSCs in Quebec, are required by law to accept and treat all peoples wherever they are from, including Indigenous communities, in the same way and in the same level of quality. So it's important to remind people of that. So we know that women's shelters are preventive in nature. They don't resolve the issue of violence, but they do prevent domestic homicides. Women do need a safe and secure place for their women and for themselves and for their children. So when there is not, so we speak of the women that do access women's shelters, but often in the case we're more concerned as well for the women that don't have access to those shelters, or when those shelters are full. And this is a situation that is a crisis here and in other provinces as well. So women's shelters are preventive in nature, we could say. The raison d'être of shelters are to provide for the physical security and safety, as well as the emotional and psychological safety of women and children who are fleeing domestic violence, providing basic rights that preserve our dignity. The shelter practitioners guide women and children through the police reportings, health and social services, youth protection, legal and the correctional services. We support Indigenous women's children in recovering from the violence holistically. So it is about helping, in particular, Indigenous women shelters with women whose first language is neither French nor English here in Quebec, as well as the Indigenous approach is also what is unique to these shelters that are members of the Quebec Native Women Shelter Network and the NACAF's network. So shelters must provide for the physical and psychological safety of women and children who are leaving violent situations. This includes providing security, both inside and outside the shelters. So shelters should be housed in a physical structure that is safe, that is not falling apart, and be accessible to women and children with disabilities. They should have an appropriate system to provide safety and security to residents and shelter workers. And it's understood that in small towns, including this one, that we all know where the women's shelter is. It was the taxi driver this morning who located the one here in Val-d'Or to me. So sometimes, of course, as we know, that women need to be sent to another community in order to be kept safe, since the shelter is not at a confidential location. Of course, in some communities, the shelters are built to be right beside the police station. So that is a mechanism in ensuring and trying to keep Indigenous women and children safe in the communities here. So women and children require a continuum of programming and support before, during, and after residing in an emergency shelter. So we know outreach services are also crucial. And now I'd like to look into defining the concept of health and the right to health from a human rights-based perspective, and also from the expert mechanism of the rights of Indigenous peoples. And the background note, the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The right to health is a fundamental part of human rights and encompasses a wide range of factors that can help people lead a healthy life. Significantly, the right to health is not synonymous with the right to be healthy. Rather, this right could be best described as the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The right to health goes beyond access to health care. It includes a wide range of factors referred to by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as the underlying determinants of health, including underlying socioeconomic conditions. These include safe drinking water, adequate nutrition and housing, healthy working and environmental conditions, health-related education and information, as well as gender equality. So health services, goods and facilities must be provided to all without any discrimination and on an equal basis. In the same line, the TRC's calls to action 18 to 24 address the health of Indigenous peoples, calling for federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments to acknowledge that the current health status of Indigenous people directly results from Canadian government's policies, including the residential school system, and the need to recognize and implement the health rights of Indigenous peoples under international and constitutional law, as well as treaties. That's the call to action number 18. The establishment of healing centers through sustainable healing, recognition of traditional Indigenous peoples' healing practices, increased numbers of Indigenous health professionals, and cultural competency training for all health professionals are identified in the calls to actions 21 to 23. hope I'm not speaking too fast, no? Okay, thank you. So as a Kukum of grandmother of 5, you know, for me, our children are our most precious resource. You know, so I'll speak to children in particular because, you know, in women's shelters, a lot of the residents are children. Sometimes we have more children than we do have women. Like I did feel at times, I said, am I working in a daycare? Because we would have residents with lots of children and, you know, so let's say we would have sometimes 3 adults and the rest were children. So, and as you know that we have more children you know, on average than the general population. So, as I said, as our most precious resource, and I will speak to what's important in you know, in the shelter as well regarding children. So, wherever possible, the following services should be provided by a full-time licensed children's counselor in the shelter. So, as victims, and not just mere witnesses of violence, children need counseling and child-centered programming. To deal with the long-term effects, children who witness violence need to have their standards reset to replace the model they have witnessed and experienced. Is just not more witnessing, because when witnessing really, you know, is not really the experience that they have, because if you are witnessing, you are experiencing and are really a survivor of that violence afterwards. Okay, so the need to reset the model that they have witnessed with a more desirable one that says abuse is wrong. It's not natural, and we know that this is a learned behavior. This can help break the intergenerational cycle of violence, you know, through play and art therapy appropriate to the children's ages. The group activities also are good. Talking circles are also helpful, as per Dr. Anita Olsen-Harper. And so for funding and security issues, we have also situations where women are only on shift 1 person at a time, and we know with all these children, even in a daycare, there are standards to have 1 person, let's say, for 5 children in Quebec. So these, we need to have to address the understaffing of women's shelters in Quebec, as well as the funding equity issue. We know that in the consultation that I did that in some locations, women on reserve are paid marginal wages, sometimes just above the minimum wage. One elder was making just about that after being educated and also trained in the field. She went to college in that and working there many years, and still was making less than somebody equivalent in the province of Quebec, 50% less in her wages. So this is the comparing shelters on reserve to the provincially funded shelters in Quebec, and as well as this is occurring in the rest of Canada. We have a case in Labrador, a case study that's included in the document we gave you this morning, and others, but there would need to be a more in-depth study of this situation. Discriminatory situation, we could say. And so the staff are overworked and face burnout. It's difficult to attract, staff with appropriate levels of skills and education. And therefore, the health and safety, security of Indigenous women and children are jeopardized. Sometimes shelters even close for a period of time. So shelters are not available when the women need them and are turned away. So the result is fewer people coming into the shelter and Indigenous women and children staying in dangerous situations. So also important is to explore community-based programs that support the removal of the offender from the home. And this is done in other countries. So this would need to be looked at here as well, maybe. So in terms of child welfare, a number of the TRC's calls to action relate to the work of shelters and transition houses, particularly those serving Indigenous women. Service providers are encouraged to assist in supporting parents to maintain custody of their children whenever possible and to provide culturally appropriate environments. That's the call to action number 1. Governments are also encouraged to educate social workers about the history and impacts of residential schools on Indigenous families and the importance of Indigenous communities and families and finding solutions to healing. So I would say Quebec must significantly and immediately reduce the high rate of separation of Indigenous people from their families and communities caused by the removal of babies and children and incarceration of youth. And youth are children too. They're under 18 years old, as defined by the United Nations. And the other government policies that are primarily directed towards Indigenous peoples. So I would echo the TRC's recommendation number 24. We call upon medical and nursing schools in Quebec to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. We call upon also, or I would, number 57 would be appropriate for the government and Quebec municipal governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relationships. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So in terms of children still in Canada, we talked about the implementation of Jordan's principle. So all levels of governments are called upon to fully implement Jordan's principle, which is intended to ensure that First Nations children receive access to health care services regardless of jurisdictional disputes or misunderstandings between federal, provincial, or territorial governments. Jordan's principle requires healthcare service providers to provide the services to First Nations children and to work this out with other level of governments the cost afterwards. That is the call to action number 3 in the TRC's recommendations. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal concluded that the federal government had discriminated against First Nations children by systemically underfunding child and family services on First Nations reserves, both in comparison to the funding available in predominantly non-Indigenous communities and relative to the needs, the real needs of First Nations families. The tribunal's ruling has important implications for the provision of services to First Nations women and their families, including shelter services. The child welfare case before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal was a result of a complaint initiated by the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and the Assembly of First Nations. in response to a gap between federal and provincial funding for child and family services of at least 22% per child. The tribunal concluded that inadequate funding on a reserved child and family services has meant that basic supports to help families in crisis were often unavailable, forcing agencies to place children in state care over issues of neglect that should be addressed through less drastic interventions. The tribunal concluded that underfunding of intervention programs creates incentives to remove children from their homes and communities, discontinuing the cycle of trauma and loss rather than addressing the harms created by policies like the residential school system. Of relevance to the provision of other services, the tribunal concluded that protections against discrimination in Canadian law mean that the government has an obligation to ensure substantive equality in the delivery of services to Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, regardless of what level of government funds, those services. So substantive equality doesn't mean identical services. It means providing services that meet the particular needs of the communities being served. The precedent-setting decision of the tribunal in the child welfare case is used in a number of ways to help advocate for greater equality and access to services for Indigenous women, including the funding of shelters in Canada. Also related to children are the correctional services, because governments are called upon to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous youth. So as I said before, I define children as being under 18, so Indigenous youth in prisons. And that's calls to action number 30 and 38. So call to action 39 calls for the federal government to develop a national action plan to collect and publish data on the criminal victimization of Indigenous peoples, including data related to homicide and family violence victimization. So I had referred you to the Center of Excellence in terms of legal services. They do provide excellent training in regards to the problematic impacts of family homes on reserve and matrimonial interests and rights in the province of Quebec. So to date, as we speak, there are no emergency protection orders. This is also explained in the manual, and no designated judge in Quebec for the emergency protection orders, and that is also a reflection of other provinces in Canada, except for the east, the Atlantic provinces. So the rest of Canada, except for the Atlantic provinces, have this issue. As the NACAF recommended that all provinces, including Quebec, train and designate judges to be able to grant emergency protection orders on behalf of women living on reserve. Quebec's educational system and institutions should commit to educate its population about Indigenous people's rights and Indigenous and colonial history to increase the Quebec population's understanding on the ongoing legal, political, and socio-cultural issues that are involved in the relationships with Indigenous peoples. So this year's NACAF's annual conference in November will focus on the legal information and human rights. Also, we train particularly in the Indigenous women shelters, so many participants, of course, that we train are the Indigenous peoples from across Canada, Indigenous women shelter practitioners. And during that meeting that we will have, Quebec participants will have a parallel meeting due to the, of course, Quebec Civil Code compared to the rest of Canada. And our training will include as well matrimonial real property. by the Center of Excellence for MRP. So the NACAF's Legal Information and Training project produced the Legal Information Manual for Shelters that we mentioned is because we're a national organization, all of our publications are available in both French and English. So I did quote much of the previous talk here in the manual that I baptized in Angosh, which means star in the Anishinaabe Algonquin language. And it was written by Celeste McKay from Winnipeg. And so I would also like to echo the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's recommendation you will find that we recommend in that manual, number 28. We call upon law schools in the province, also including Quebec, to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people and the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. I would also call upon the Quebec government to commit to the recognition and implementation of Aboriginal justice systems in a manner consistent with the treaty and Aboriginal rights of Aboriginal peoples, the Constitution Act 1982, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples endorsed by Canada in November 2012. So I seem to be repeating myself, but it's all good, eh, education? It is. Yes. So in respect to justice services, the call to action number 42 identifies implementation of indigenous justice systems. Also, I'd like to speak about police services now, because I believe that's under your mandate. Yeah. And the relationship with police, Indigenous peoples, relationship with police historically, briefly, the police have played a role in imposing foreign systems and rules meant to oppress Indigenous peoples, creating and maintaining socioeconomic inequalities, which has been characterized as structural violence. And structural violence is most easily perceived in its net effects. Example, impoverishment, unequal life expectancy, poorer health, and differential employment rates, which we spoke of today. So also there was the role in the history of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in enforcing the residential school policy. Because of the role that police, social workers, and we can say that the social workers are today, modern day missionaries, and as well as the government officials have placed in enforcing oppressive and discriminatory laws and policies. Many Indigenous peoples in Canada are understandably apprehensive about their interactions with authority figures, whom at times have abused their power. Also, I'd like to speak about not so much of what the police services have done, because I think that there were some, very important testimonies about that, but also about what they don't do. For example, I have a director of social services located in Natuk, who has reported to the National Aboriginal Circle Against Family Violence that the police were not intervening when called in domestic violence situations there. So I had to, and this is important in Quebec, we know there are some mechanisms. I referred her to la commissaire à la déontologie policière in Quebec. So I don't know, that's what I could do at that point. So these are the kind of reports that are important and stories to mention, because everybody's experience is valid. So it's important to report those. And of course, I know that there is some training at l'École nationale de police for the police, so I commend those as well. It would be important, of course, to, we'll speak of that as well, to train the non-Indigenous police, as we were, in addition to the, well, to all police will need training, I would say. And I know that Quebec Native Women does give a training on how to deal in cases of family violence. And I did speak to the police officers as well who had participated in that training. And he said he felt more comfortable training after, intervening, I mean, in cases of domestic violence after he received that training. So I don't know about the evaluation of the training, but this was the story that he told me. So, in regards to the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliations Commission of Canada's call to action, in 2015, the number 24 call to action related to the legacy of residential school system in the areas of child welfare, language and culture, health and justice. The calls to action also related to reconciliation in numerous areas, including in Canadian governments and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, equity for Indigenous people in the legal system. So, I don't know what we have here for time. If, it's about an hour. So, I'm open to any questions that you may have. And would like to, first of all, as well, thank you for giving me the time here today to present to you. Any questions?
It was a pleasure to listen to you. Maître Barry-Gosselin, do you have some questions?
Yes, if I may, Monsieur le Commissaire. So just to go back, you were speaking a few minutes ago about training of police officers. Do you believe or do you hear from your work on the ground that also training of a crown prosecutor or judge or other actor of the judicial system can be important also for them to be ready to have intervention and to deal with Indigenous women?
Definitely, and I believe Amnesty International also recommended that. Yes.
And do you have any specific recommendation about that, the kind of training, or you're just recommending that there should be some trainings for all the public servants dealing with Indigenous people?
I think that there should be an inventory of the trainings that are available, and it's important for Indigenous women to be the trainers as well, to be able to give their experience, like I said, on the ground, because they are also the women shelter practitioners, experts in giving, practical recommendations, and so that the policies do make sense at the end of the day, so that the women, the victims of violence, and their children be helped in the most, in a good way.
So also to involve the victim themselves of conjugal violence or family violence in the training of the public servant could be a good idea? To have the people, like, for example, victims of family violence, to be involved in the training of the public servant could be a good idea? We'd like to speak about not re-victimizing the victims as well. So I'm not saying the victims per se, but the ones that do advocate for the victims is important until, and it's good for, of course, the voice of the victims that feel prepared, that do want, but not to put them in a situation, I would say, that sometimes, not to enforce that, Oh, of course.
And so we still have a long walk in terms of education. And so it's important also to speak of the shelter practitioners, the workers who do sometimes experience vicarious traumatization. So there needs to be some assistance there as well in terms of shelter workers.
And earlier in your presentation, you talk about statistics, so how many women shelter in communities and Inuit communities and other communities in Quebec. But is there some, because I read during the weekend the alternative report to the UN committee, and there was some mention about some specific challenge for the Inuit communities. So can you maybe a little bit address these challenges for the funding, for example, of the women shelter in Inuit communities that we have, or it's all in the report and you are referring to the report, because I saw that there was no dedicated funding for Inuit and Métis communities. So for the women's shelter, it's even more difficult to have funding up north or in the in Inuit communities. So do you have any more information about that?
I would first of all recommend that you do invite the Indigenous Women's Organization to speak to that, because they do have a shelter worker shelter file. But in the, I will speak to the, more specifically, there was the Amnesty Canada's campaign, and it did speak about Indigenous women's shelters there. And it states that there are roughly 15 shelters and transition houses serving 53 Inuit communities across the Arctic. And some of these shelters are extremely small, and most communities are accessible only by air. So that's in the Amnesty International Canada's campaign for Canada to close the gap to ensure safety and support for Indigenous women, and girls escaping violence. So in there was a mention of Indigenous women shelters. But the Quebec Native Women's Shelter Network as well includes the 3 women shelters, and that are from the Inuit territory.
And I will have a last question about the shelters in the urban area. So you explained earlier that there was 2 funded by the provincial, one in Montreal and one in Quebec.
Yes.
So they are dedicated for Indigenous women and children. Mm-hmm. But other than that, there's maybe more resources in urban area, but do you believe that the training is sufficient for the people working in these shelters to be able to intervene with Indigenous people, women or children? Do you believe that there should be some recommendation about that for urban area, for example?
Well, we did recommend to that there would be some shelter workers, that could be hired in the non-Indigenous shelters as well, that have a high population of Indigenous residents. And we know that in these shelters, let's say, for example, the one I worked at, the Native Women Shelter of Montreal, half of the residents were Inuit. So it was a cross-cultural work that we did do as well. And all of the residents are from the various nations. And so it is intercultural work that we do in terms of, and it's not just about the language, but it's also important that the victim of violence be accompanied when she goes to the public services in Quebec. So in 1992, one of the residents, she was Inuk woman, and did not speak barely English or not at all French. So she was diagnosed by a doctor who was not Inuk himself, and he diagnosed her as schizophrenic. So she was put on medication, put into the system. So we've seen these kind of things happen. So that's why it's very important to train as well the public service servants in all of the services we spoke of today.
Thank you very much, Madame Brazeau. For myself, I have no further questions.
Okay. Mme Miller?
Good day, Madame Brazeau. I was not able to have a copy of the documents that you filed this morning, so
Okay,
I don't know if they answer my questions, but I'm still going to ask them.
Okay.
Would it be possible to give us examples, because I know there's a lot of studies that talk about underfunding of these women's shelters. Could you give us examples of, to show us the correlation between the underfunding and the continuation of violence? Examples, for example, a woman wants, has a situation, she wants to get in a shelter, there's no place. How does that continue the cycle of violence in her life or her family?
Okay. In Quebec, there was a case of a triple homicide, and that was following the closure of a shelter. So I think that, if there's no access to safe places, women do not, we don't really know the severity as well. And in terms of statistics, they're not being shared with us by the police in terms of identifying the victims of violence. So all of that, there needs to be a better working relationship between the police and the shelters in order to get all that data.
Okay, thank you. You talked earlier that the Montreal and Quebec shelters are funded by the provincial government, and you also talked about the underfunding of shelters in general in Canada, because this is a commission where we are more specifically talking about the provincial provinces. Is there, to your knowledge, what prevents the provincial government to fund other shelters apart from Montreal and Quebec?
Pardon, what was the last part?
What prevents the provincial government to help fund for other shelters other than in Montreal or Quebec? Because you said earlier that there was the Montreal and Quebec shelters are funded by the provincial government. What prevents the provincial government from funding other shelters in other regions?
I think that in the case of Akwesasne, I believe that they are receiving both provincial and federal funding for their shelter, being in the jurisdictional. It's a jurisdictional always issue, I believe. And I don't think that there are anything that should prevent.
Okay. Okay. Because my other question is that how could the provincial government help close the gap? Because you talked about a gap where there is missing funding. So if the federal government does not provide it, how can the provincial services help fill that gap? Do you have any ideas? Or
well, they should, largely apply the due diligence principle to all services and use that. And this would help the situation as well.
So the
rather than us being in a jurisdictional hot potato, no, you belong here, you're nobody's baby. So this is where this could be resolved probably amongst the federal and provincial governments.
Okay.
Would be no excuse to help all victims of violence.
Because, for example, you talked about how educating or giving emotional support to the children can break the cycle of violence. Would that be a service that could be given by, provincial services to the children if there is no funding from the federal part?
Yes, and we need really qualified peoples to give that service to the children.
Okay, thank you.
So good idea.
Okay.
I'm finished.
Okay, thank you.
I might have some after the break, but...
Okay.
Thank you. Maître Boucher, you have questions?
J'ai pas de questions, merci.
Maître Artaud?
Oui, peut-être une question et un commentaire.
You see, it's possible to approach on the table nearby the witness. I should have told Maitre Miller, next time you may approach on the table. Yeah, it's easier either for you and the witness. Okay.
One comment before I ask my question, just to let the Commission know that on Thursday morning we will be with Annie Baron. She's the president of Saturvit Inuit Women Association of Nunavik. And of course we'll address this issue of women's shelters up north, that we have 3, like you mentioned, one in Kuujjuaq and 2 others. And you're totally right, there is no specific funding for these shelters. They're all funded either by Makivik Corporation directly or by some northern villages with public money, but deriving from public programs that are not targeted specifically for women's shelter. But I'd like to go back to what Maître Barry-Gosselin raised in her first question, actually, about training. Do you see training being more efficient when it's done in schools, even in trade schools, or on-the-job training? Once the person's in the position, let's say, as a social worker, police officer, or that type of work, what would you see being more efficient?
That's a good question, because it's also to do with prevention. Of course, I would say it should start in elementary school. And once they are, let's say, example, the police officers, once they are in the field, it's a different situation. They're not open, they're forced to go to these, trainings. A little bit more open, I found, in my experience, when they were students, like still in the school. So more open, because that's why they were there, to learn. So it wasn't imposed. So all of this training needs to be, of course, voluntary. And in terms of education in general, it needs to be started, of course, high school as well. This is the situation that we're finding ourselves in today, because people are saying that they didn't receive this throughout their formal education. I just gave a training as well to the faculty and staff at Concordia University. And sadly, they did not receive this training in the educational system in Quebec. And this is a situation that's all across Canada as well. Thank you.
No further question. Thank you very much.
Question? Thank you very much, Mme Brazeau.
Merci.
It was a pleasure to listen to you. And I wish the best for you and your program. If you have any other suggestions for us, you are allowed to communicate with us whenever you want. You see, we still have our arms, eyes, ears, and heart open to listen to what you have to say.
Oh, thank you so much. And as well, any exchange and meeting of peoples is, it's an exchange of gifts. So, miigwech, thank you. And as the same, if you have any additional questions that comes to you later, we are definitely open to working together.
Thank you. We'll suspend. Do we have something else, somebody else this morning?
Not for this morning. I will suggest to 1:30 this afternoon with Monsieur Serge Bouchard.
So,
thank you.
Have a nice day.
Veuillez vous lever. Suspension de l'audience, de retour à 13h30.